It was a crisp autumn morning when everything changed at the Metropolitan Police Department. The sunlight streamed through the Venetian blinds in Captain Thompson's office, casting striped shadows across her desk where a cream-colored envelope lay unopened. She'd been staring at it for the past 10 minutes, a coffee growing cold beside her computer. 25 years of memories filled this office, photos of graduating cadets she'd mentored, commendations from community leaders, and that one newspaper clipping from when her team broke up a major drug trafficking ring. But this envelope, this one piece of paper would change everything. Taking a deep breath, she finally picked it up. Her hands, usually steady from years of firearms training, trembled slightly as she broke the seal. As she unfolded the letter, her eyes scanned the words that would make history. "We are pleased to inform you of your selection as the new chief of police." She had to read it 3 times before it really sank in. After all those years of extra shifts, countless hours of community outreach, and pushing through barriers that seemed immovable, she'd done it. The first black woman to lead the department in its 127-year history. Thompson leaned back in her chair, thinking about her father who'd served as a patrol officer in the same department for 30 years. He'd always told her, "Baby girl, you can't just be good, you've got to be exceptional." And exceptional she'd been, graduating top of her class at the academy, earning her master's degree while working full-time, and solving cases that had stumped veterans twice her age. She glanced at her phone, wanting to call her family immediately, but something held her back. A small smile played across her lips as she decided to keep this quiet for now. No press releases, no big announcements. She'd start in 2 weeks, just walk in and do the job like she'd done every day for the past quarter century. Looking out her window, she watched officers in the parking lot below going about their routine. Checking their patrol cars, chatting over coffee, heading out for their shifts. None of them knew that history was being made right above their heads. Some of those same officers had doubted her when she first made detective, questioned her decisions when she became captain. Now they'd be reporting to her. But this wasn't about proving anyone wrong. For Thompson, this was about making things right. She pulled out a notepad and began jotting down ideas for her first 100 days, updated training protocols, community engagement initiatives, transparency measures. Her mind was already racing with possibilities. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Captain." It was Officer Chen with case files needing her signature. Thompson smiled, signing the documents while keeping the appointment letter carefully tucked away in her drawer. For now, she was still their captain, but in 2 weeks. As the day wound down, Thompson gathered her things, taking one last look around her captain's office. Soon she'd be moving upstairs to the chief's suite, but this room would always hold a special place in her heart. It was where she'd broken her first major case as detective, where she'd mentored countless young officers, and where she'd just received the news that would change not only her life, but potentially the entire department. Walking to her car, she nodded to several officers heading home for the day. They had no idea that their lives were about to change too. In just 2 weeks, she would step into a role that would allow her to implement the changes she'd been dreaming about for years. But first, she had one more drive home as Captain Thompson, a drive that would prove more eventful than she could have possibly imagined. Little did she know, the next few hours would provide her first test as chief before she'd even officially started the job. Sometimes life has a funny way of preparing you for what's coming next, and for Thompson, that preparation was about to come in the form of flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror. The evening air was cool as Thompson drove home, her mind still buzzing with the day's events. She'd wrapped up her final tasks as captain, cleared out some old files, and said goodbye to her familiar office, though she kept that part casual since no one knew she wouldn't be returning to that particular room. Her silver sedan purred along the quiet streets as streetlights began flickering to life. The radio played softly in the background, some old soul music that reminded her of Sunday afternoons at her parents' house. She was already planning how to tell them about her promotion, maybe over Sunday dinner, watching their faces light up with pride. She changed into civilian clothes before leaving the station, a simple blue blazer and slacks. After all these years in uniform, it still felt strange sometimes, being in regular clothes. But she'd learned long ago that there was value in seeing the world from different perspectives. Tomorrow, she'd wear her new chief's uniform for the first time, but tonight she was just another citizen heading home. The dashboard clock read 7:45 p.m. when she noticed the dark SUV that had been following her for the past few blocks. Years of police work had taught her to be observant, but she didn't think much of it until she saw the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. "Well, this is interesting," she murmured to herself, carefully signaling and pulling over to the curb. The streets were quiet here, lined with old oak trees and modest homes. She'd driven this route hundreds of times without incident. As she put the car in park, she couldn't help but wonder what had caught their attention. Following standard procedure, the same procedure she'd taught countless rookies, Thompson turned off her engine, placed her hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, and waited. In her rearview mirror, she watched two officers approach her car, one on each side. They were young, probably not more than a few years out of the academy. Their flashlight beams swept across her car's interior. The officer on the driver's side tapped on her window. Thompson pressed the button to lower it, maintaining her calm demeanor. "Good evening, officers," she said pleasantly, noting how the younger officer's hand rested near his belt, standard procedure, but it spoke volumes about their mindset. "License and registration, please," the officer said, his tone professional but with an edge that suggested he'd already made certain assumptions. "Do you know why we stopped you tonight?" Thompson kept her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her documents. "I'm not sure, officer. Was I speeding?" She knew she hadn't been. Her years of training had made careful driving second nature. "You made an irregular lane change back there," the officer said, though Thompson knew her driving had been textbook perfect. "And your window tint seems a bit dark." She handed over her license and registration, watching their faces in her side mirror. She could have mentioned who she was right away, pulled out her badge, or name-dropped any number of high-ranking officers. But something told her to wait, to observe. After all, in less than 24 hours, she'd be responsible for training and leadership decisions that would affect officers just like these. The senior officer walked back to their patrol car with her documents while his partner kept watch. Thompson sat quietly, her mind already turning this moment into a teaching opportunity. In her career, she'd seen both sides of this situation, as an officer conducting stops and as a black woman being stopped. Each perspective had taught her valuable lessons about power, respect, and judgment. The next few minutes would reveal a lot about these officers, about her department, and about the work that still needed to be done. As she waited for the officer to return, Thompson smiled slightly, knowing that sometimes the best lessons come when you least expect them, and tomorrow's first day as chief was already beginning, right here on this quiet street. The flashlight beam swept across Thompson's face once again as the senior officer returned from the patrol car. She could read uncertainty in his expression now. Something in her documentation had caught his attention. The younger officer still stood at the passenger side, his posture tense but professional. "Ma'am, could you step out of the vehicle, please?" the senior officer asked. His tone had shifted slightly, not quite as authoritative as before, but still maintaining his official demeanor. Thompson nodded calmly. "Of course, officer." She kept her movements slow and deliberate, just as she'd taught her own officers over the years. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, she stood tall, her presence naturally commanding despite her civilian clothes. "Could you explain your connection to the police department?" the officer asked, holding her credentials in his hand. The beam of his flashlight had lowered, no longer shining in her face. A car passed by slowly, its headlights briefly illuminating all three of them standing on the roadside. "I'm a police officer," Thompson replied simply, watching realization dawn on their faces. "Currently holding the rank of captain." She paused for a moment before adding, "though that's about to change." The younger officer shifted his weight uncomfortably. They were both probably wondering if this was some sort of test or evaluation. In their position, she might have wondered the same thing. "I apologize, Captain," the senior officer started, but Thompson raised her hand gently to pause him. "Let's talk about what made you decide to pull me over," she said, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used countless times in training sessions. "You mentioned an irregular lane change and window tint. I'd like to understand what you observed." The officers exchanged glances. The senior officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, when we observed your vehicle, we thought—" He stopped, perhaps realizing how his next words might sound. "You thought?" Thompson prompted, keeping her voice neutral but encouraging. This was a teaching moment, and she intended to make it count. "We received reports of suspicious vehicles in the area," the younger officer offered, speaking up for the first time. "But they all knew that wasn't the real reason for the stop." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "I've been on your side of this interaction many times," she said, looking between them. "And I've been on this side of it too. Both perspectives have taught me valuable lessons about what it means to serve and protect." She could see them processing her words, their initial embarrassment giving way to attention. The street was quiet now, just the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze and distant traffic sounds. "Tomorrow morning, things are going to change at the department," Thompson continued. "And this moment, right here, is exactly why those changes are necessary." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out the letter she'd received that morning, holding it up but not yet showing its contents. "In my 25 years on the force, I've learned that our greatest moments of growth often come from our most uncomfortable situations. Would you agree?" She looked at each officer in turn, seeing understanding begin to dawn in their expressions. The senior officer nodded slowly, realization creeping into his features as he pieced together the significance of her words and the letter in her hand. His partner still looked confused, but was listening intently. "Ma'am," the senior officer began, his voice carrying a new note of recognition, "are you?" Thompson smiled, finally unfolding the letter that announced her appointment as chief. The streetlight above them flickered to life, illuminating the official letterhead and the words that would change everything. This was the moment everything shifted, not just for these two officers, but for the entire department. Tomorrow morning, the news would be official, but right here, on this quiet street, 3 police officers were about to learn an unforgettable lesson about assumptions, justice, and the power of perspective. The 2 officers stood in stunned silence as they read the letter appointing Thompson as their new chief. The night had grown quieter, as if the world itself was pausing to witness this moment. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine from a nearby garden. "I believe this changes things a bit," Thompson said softly, but not unkindly. She watched as the senior officer's hand, still holding her driver's license, dropped slowly to his side. His partner's mouth had formed a small O of surprise. "Chief," the senior officer managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. We." He struggled to find the right words, his previous confidence replaced by uncertainty. Thompson leaned casually against her car, her posture deliberately relaxed. "You know what I see right now?" she asked, looking at both officers. "I see 2 dedicated police officers doing their job. But I also see an opportunity for us all to learn something valuable." The younger officer shifted his weight nervously. Chief, we were just following protocol with the traffic stop." His voice trailed off as Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Were you?" she asked gently. "Let's talk about that protocol. When you first spotted my car, what exactly drew your attention?" Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was the same voice she'd used countless times when mentoring young officers. The partners exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, the senior officer spoke up, his honesty breaking through his embarrassment. "The vehicle, it seemed out of place in this neighborhood. And when we saw..." He stopped, the unspoken words hanging in the air. "When you saw me," Thompson completed his sentence. "A black woman driving an expensive car in this neighborhood." She stated it as a fact, without anger or judgment. "Tell me, how many traffic stops have you made this week with similar reasoning?" Both officers looked down at their boots. The answer was clear in their silence. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to walk into headquarters as your new chief," Thompson continued, her voice warm but firm. "But right now, I'm going to be your teacher. Let's turn those flashlights off and have a real conversation." The officers clicked off their lights, and for the first time, they truly saw each other in the soft glow of the street lamp. Thompson pulled out her phone and showed them a photo of her father in his police uniform from 30 years ago. "My father faced the same kind of stops when he was off duty," she explained. "He taught me that change doesn't come from pointing fingers or making people feel ashamed. It comes from understanding each other's perspectives." The younger officer looked at the photo, then at Thompson. "Your father was on the force too." 27 years," Thompson smiled. He taught me that being a good police officer isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about building trust, one interaction at a time. She could see their defensiveness melting away, replaced by genuine interest. The senior officer handed back a license, his hand slightly shaky. "Chief," he said, his voice steadier now, "I think we could learn a lot from you." Thompson nodded, noting how they both stood straighter, their earlier discomfort transforming into attention and respect. "That's the plan," she replied. "But remember, this moment isn't about making you feel bad. It's about making our department better." A passing car's headlights swept over them, reminding them they were still standing by the roadside, but none of them moved. This moment was too important to rush. "Tomorrow, we'll start making changes," Thompson continued. "But tonight, I want you to finish your patrol thinking about one question: how can we protect and serve everyone in our community with equal respect and dignity?" The officers nodded thoughtfully, their earlier embarrassment replaced by determination. This unexpected traffic stop had turned into something none of them would ever forget: a lesson about bias, leadership, and the power of turning uncomfortable moments into opportunities for growth. The realization of who Thompson was had changed the entire atmosphere of the traffic stop. The street lamp cast long shadows on the pavement as both officers stood straighter, their faces showing a mix of respect and nervous anticipation. This wasn't just their new chief. This was someone who had caught them in a moment that could have serious consequences. "I know what you're thinking," Thompson said, breaking the tense silence. "You're wondering if this is going to end up in your files, if this might affect your careers." She tucked the chief's appointment letter back into her blazer pocket, noting how they'd both tracked the movement with anxious eyes. A dog barked in the distance, and somewhere down the street, a screen door slammed. Life was going on as normal, but for these three people standing on the roadside, everything had changed. "First thing tomorrow morning, every officer in the department is going to know about this traffic stop," Thompson continued, watching their faces pale slightly. "But not in the way you might think." She pulled out her phone again, this time showing them a photo of herself as a rookie officer. 25 years ago, I was exactly where you are now. Young, eager to prove myself, and yes, sometimes making assumptions that I shouldn't have." The younger officer shifted his weight, finding his voice. "Chief, about those assumptions, we really didn't mean to." Thompson held up her hand gently. "I know, but that's exactly what we need to talk about. The things we do without meaning to can sometimes have the biggest impact." A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of sirens. Somewhere out there, their fellow officers were responding to other calls, unaware that department history was being made on this quiet street. "Look at your watches," Thompson said suddenly. Both officers glanced down automatically. "It's been about 15 minutes since you first pulled me over. In that time, what have you learned?" The senior officer cleared his throat. "That appearances can be deceiving, ma'am." "And," she prompted. "That we need to check our assumptions," the younger officer added, standing a bit taller. "That every traffic stop is an opportunity to either build trust or break it." Thompson smiled warmly. "Now that's the kind of insight I'm looking for in my officers. Tomorrow, when you come to the morning briefing, I want you to share this experience with your fellow officers." Their eyes widened in surprise. This wasn't the punishment they'd been expecting. "But Chief," the senior officer started, "won't that just show everyone how we messed up?" "No," Thompson replied firmly. "It will show everyone how we can learn and grow. Your willingness to acknowledge and learn from this moment, that's what's going to make you better officers." She could see the tension leaving their shoulders as they realized this wasn't the end of their careers, but rather a new beginning. The night had grown darker, but the atmosphere around them had lightened considerably. "Before we end this traffic stop," Thompson said, reaching into her car, "I want to share something else with you." She pulled out a small notebook, the kind every officer carries. "I've been keeping notes about changes I want to make in the department. And thanks to you both, I now have a new first page." The officers leaned in slightly as she wrote by the light of their flashlights. Day 1. Transform every challenge into a teaching moment. Looking up at them, she smiled. "Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places. Tomorrow, we're going to start making our department better, and it's going to start with this story, your story." As they prepared to return to their patrol car, both officers stood a little straighter, their expressions showing not just relief, but genuine understanding. This traffic stop hadn't gone at all as they planned, but it had turned into something much more valuable, a moment of real change. The next morning arrived with a golden sunrise that painted the police headquarters in warm light. Thompson stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully pinning the new chief's badge to her freshly pressed uniform. Each star on the collar felt weightier than any insignia she'd worn before. The events of last night's traffic stop were still fresh in her mind as she drove to the station. She'd spent hours after getting home thinking about how to use that experience to set the tone for her first day. Sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in unexpected packages, her father used to say. As she pulled into the parking lot, she noticed the two officers from last night standing near the entrance, already waiting. They were early, a good sign. Their uniforms were crisp, their badges gleaming in the morning sun. When they saw her car, they both straightened up even more. "Good morning, officers," Thompson called out as she approached, carrying a box of files and her morning coffee. Both immediately stepped forward to help with the box. "Good morning, Chief," they responded in unison, their voices clear and confident despite the nervous energy she could sense beneath their professional demeanor. Inside, the station was buzzing with its usual morning activity. Officers coming off night shift were filing their reports while the day shift was gathering for briefing. The familiar smell of coffee and paper filled the air, but today it felt different. Today, everything was different. Thompson paused at the entrance to the briefing room, listening to the chatter inside. Nobody knew yet, except for the two officers beside her. She turned to them with a reassuring smile. "Ready to help me change some minds?" she asked quietly. The senior officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We've been thinking about what you said last night. About turning challenges into teaching moments." His partner added, "We won't let you down, Chief." Thompson pushed open the door to the briefing room. The usual morning noise died down as officers noticed her entering, first seeing the uniform of a fellow officer, then registering the chief's insignia, and finally recognizing who was wearing it. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. She walked to the front of the room, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. The two officers from last night took their seats, but she could see them sitting taller than their colleagues. They knew what was coming. "Good morning," Thompson began, her voice clear and strong. "Some of you may have heard rumors about changes in leadership. Those rumors are true." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "But before we talk about my appointment as your new chief, I want to tell you about a traffic stop that happened last night." The two officers from the stop kept their eyes forward as their colleagues glanced around, wondering where this was going. Thompson could see the mix of emotions on faces around the room: surprise, curiosity, and yes, some uncertainty. "Last night, two of our officers conducted a routine traffic stop. They saw something that didn't look quite right to them, at least. That's what they thought at first. What they actually saw was their preconceptions at work. And what happened next?" She gestured for the two officers to stand up. They rose smoothly, shoulders back, heads high. "What happened next showed me exactly why I'm proud to be your chief. Because when these officers realized their mistake, they didn't make excuses. They listened. They learned. And most importantly, they showed me that this department is ready for change." The room stayed quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of surprise. It was the silence of people beginning to understand that something important was happening. "Today marks a new chapter for our department," Thompson continued, her voice warm but firm. "And we're going to start by learning from each other. These officers have a story to tell you. A story about a traffic stop that didn't go quite as planned." The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting dust motes in the air as the two officers made their way to the front of the room. Their steps were steady, their purpose clear. They were about to help write the first page of a new chapter in their department's history. As the two officers finished telling their story to the briefing room, you could have heard a pin drop. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the room felt warmer, not just from the sunlight, but from the shared understanding that was growing among the officers present. "Thank you for your honesty," Thompson said, standing again. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each officer. "Now, who else has a story they'd like to share?" A moment when you realized you might have judged too quickly. At first, no one moved. Then a veteran officer in the back raised his hand. 10 years ago, he began, his voice gruff but sincere, I made a similar stop. Never got the chance to make it right. Been carrying that with me ever since. Another hand went up. Last month, I responded to a call about a suspicious person in the park. Turned out to be a college professor bird watching. I felt terrible about how I approached the situation. One by one, officers began sharing their experiences. Each story was different, but they all carried the same message. They'd all had moments they wished they could do over. The room that had started the morning divided by surprise and uncertainty was becoming united by honesty and shared experience. Thompson let the conversations flow, watching as barriers began to break down. She noticed how the younger officers were listening intently to their more experienced colleagues and how veteran officers were nodding in recognition at the rookies' admissions. This, she said finally, gesturing to the room, this is how we start. Not with new policies handed down from above, but with real conversations about real experiences. Every person we interact with has a story, just like each of us has a story. She walked to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. Let's talk about what we can do differently. What changes would you suggest, based on your experiences? The ideas started flowing. A senior officer suggested regular community meet and greets where citizens could share their perspectives. A rookie proposed riding with officers from different neighborhoods to broaden their understanding. The two officers from last night's traffic stop recommended reviewing stop statistics to identify patterns they might not have noticed before. Thompson wrote each suggestion down, her heart swelling with pride. This was what real change looked like, not forced from above, but growing from within. Starting today, she announced, capping the marker, we're going to implement a new training program. But it won't be like any training you've had before. You're going to be both the teachers and the students. She pulled out her notebook, the same one from last night, and began sharing her vision. Teams would be mixed up, partnering experienced officers with rookies, desk officers with patrol. Each week, they would share experiences, discuss challenges, and work together to find better ways to serve their community. The badge we wear isn't just a symbol of authority, Thompson continued, touching her new chief's badge. It's a symbol of trust, and trust has to be earned every day, with every interaction. The morning briefing ran longer than usual that day, but nobody seemed to mind. As officers filed out to begin their shifts, there was a different energy in the air. Several stopped to share more ideas with Thompson, while others formed small groups in the hallway, continuing their discussions. The two officers from the traffic stop were the last to leave. Chief, the senior officer said, "Thank you for turning our mistake into something positive." Thompson smiled. "Thank you for being brave enough to share it. Sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones people need to hear the most." As she watched them leave, Thompson knew this was just the beginning. Real change wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen, one honest conversation, one shared story, one learning moment at a time. 3 months into Chief Thompson's leadership, the changes in the department were impossible to miss. The morning sun streamed through newly installed windows in the community meeting room, a space that used to be a storage area for old files. Now it was filled with the voices of officers and community members sharing stories and building bridges. Today, Thompson stood at the back of the room, watching with quiet pride as the two officers from that fateful traffic stop led a training session. They had become some of her strongest advocates for change, turning their experience into a powerful teaching tool. Remember, the senior officer was saying to a group of new recruits, it's not just about following procedures. It's about seeing the whole person in front of you. His partner nodded, adding details from their own learning journey. A knock on the door drew Thompson's attention. It was her assistant with the latest department statistics. As she flipped through the pages, a smile spread across her face. Civilian complaints were down 40%. Community engagement was up. Response times had improved, but more importantly, the quality of those responses had transformed. She remembered a call from last week. An elderly woman had phoned in about suspicious activity in her neighborhood. Instead of rushing in with assumptions, the responding officers had taken time to listen. Turned out the suspicious people were college volunteers helping elderly residents with home repairs. The officers ended up joining the program on their off-duty hours. Walking through the station halls, Thompson noticed other changes too. The walls, once bare except for regulation notices, now displayed photos of officers at community events, playing basketball with kids, serving meals at the local shelter, attending neighborhood meetings. Real moments of connection, not just posed PR shots. In the break room, she overheard two officers discussing a recent stop. Before I said anything, I asked myself, what would Chief Thompson do? One was saying. Took a breath, approached with an open mind. Turned out he was a new resident who got lost looking for his house. Ended up giving him directions and welcoming him to the neighborhood. Thompson filled her coffee cup, smiling to herself. The lesson from that first traffic stop had rippled out in ways she hadn't imagined. Officers were thinking differently, acting differently, seeing their role in the community differently. Her phone buzzed, a message from the mayor. The city council wanted to recognize the department's progress. Thompson typed a quick reply, suggesting they hold the ceremony in the neighborhood where she'd been pulled over that night. Sometimes the best way to measure progress is to return to where it all began. Back in her office, she found the two officers waiting with an update on their community outreach program. The same officers who once pulled her over were now leading workshops on bias awareness and community relations. Chief, the younger officer said excitedly, we've had requests from 3 other departments to share our training program. They want to know how we made such big changes so quickly. Thompson picked up the photo of her father that sat on her desk. Tell them it starts with one moment of honesty, she said. One traffic stop, one conversation, one person willing to learn from a mistake instead of hiding it. Looking out her window at the busy street below, she watched officers and citizens going about their day. There was a different kind of interaction now, more smiles, more casual conversations, more trust being built one moment at a time. The afternoon sun caught her chief's badge, making it shine. She thought about that night 3 months ago, standing on a dark street with 2 nervous officers. None of them knew then that their uncomfortable moment would spark a transformation that would spread far beyond their department. You know what the best part is? She asked the officers. This is just the beginning. Every day, we're writing new stories of change, and every one of them matters. 1 year had passed since that fateful traffic stop. Chief Thompson stood at the podium in the community center, looking out at a room filled with both officers and citizens. The afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, creating patches of colorful light across the gathered crowd. When I started this job, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, someone asked me what my biggest challenge would be. They expected me to talk about crime rates or budget issues. She paused, smiling. Instead, I told them about a traffic stop. In the front row, the 2 officers from that night sat tall in their newly pressed uniforms. They'd both earned promotions, not because of that night, but because of what they'd done with every day since. Real change, Thompson continued, doesn't come from new rules or fancy programs. It comes from moments of truth, moments when we look at ourselves honestly and decide to do better. She gestured to a large screen behind her where photos began to appear. Officers reading to kids at the local library, community cookouts in neighborhoods that used to view police with suspicion, training sessions where citizens and officers learned from each other's experiences. In 1 year, our department has changed, but more importantly, our community has changed. We've learned to see each other as people first, and it all started with 2 officers who were willing to learn from a mistake instead of defending it. The statistics were impressive. Complaints down 60%, community trust levels at an all-time high, crime rates dropping as cooperation between police and citizens increased. But the real story wasn't in the numbers. Last week, Thompson shared, I watched one of our veteran officers sitting on a porch with an elderly resident, just listening to stories about how the neighborhood had changed over the years. That same afternoon, I saw 2 rookie officers playing chess in the park with a group of teenagers. She pulled out her old notebook, the same one from that first night. Its pages were worn now, filled with notes and ideas, successes and lessons learned. But the moment that touched me most happened yesterday, she continued. I was driving home when I saw one of our patrol cars make a traffic stop. The officer approached the car with respect, introduced himself with a smile, and took time to explain why he'd made the stop. The driver, who'd been tense at first, relaxed. They ended up having a real conversation. Thompson closed her notebook and looked directly at the audience. That officer had no idea his chief was watching. He was just doing what we now all do, treating each encounter as an opportunity to build trust. The two officers from the original traffic stop stood up, joined by dozens of others. Together, they'd created a training program that was being adopted by departments across the country. Their story, that awkward, uncomfortable traffic stop, had become a powerful tool for teaching about bias, respect, and the importance of seeing beyond first impressions. 1 year ago, I stood on a dark street with two officers who thought their careers might be over. Today, those same officers are helping to reshape what police work looks like in our country. That's the power of turning a mistake into a mission. Thompson touched her chief's badge, thinking of her father and all the officers who'd come before. "We're not perfect," she admitted. "We still make mistakes, but now we learn from them. We grow from them. We use them to build something better." The room erupted in applause, but Thompson wasn't finished. She held up her hand for quiet. "This isn't the end of our story," she said softly. "It's just the beginning. Because every day brings new chances to learn, to grow, to serve better. And as long as we remember that night, that one traffic stop that changed everything, we'll keep moving forward together." As she looked out at the faces before her, officers and citizens, young and old, all united in purpose, Thompson knew that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. All you need is the courage to learn from them.